accessibility and disability representation in the horror genre. It's something that's been written about and spoken of, but it's always fallen to the wayside of the greater canon of horror criticism. It's not all that surprising. Horror is a genre that often relies on the grotesqueries of body horror, or tropes surrounding the dangers of mental illness in the slasher. It doesn't quite encourage the sort of critical analyses that would attack the discursive underpinnings of horror films, or question its effects on viewers. Chucky and the Child's Play series is unfortunately no different. While Child's Play does show some aspects of positive representation of disability and identity that have been sorely underrepresented in most genres, including horror, it falls into some of the same ableist pitfalls of other productions and includes problematic aspects which contributes towards societal prejudices and assumptions of those living with disabilities and accessibility barriers. So let's talk about it. Join me, dear listener, as we enter the second entry in our 3-part series on Chucky and critical theory, where we'll explore some of the ways Chucky succeeds and fails in tackling disability discourses. Welcome to The Witching Hour. In my last video, I heaped praise onto the franchise and its creator Don Mancini for how it integrated queer themes like representation, culture, and camp into the flesh of the Child's Play series and its leading man, Chucky. But I have to confess, there are areas that Child's Play fails to properly address and ends up reinforcing stereotypes/narratives which contribute towards systemic issues in film and television. One of those, which I'd like to highlight, is how disability is approached and the potential risk of engaging in ableist narratives. So that's what I'd like to talk to you about today, if you'd honor me with your time, of course. Child's Play is a film series which features disabled characters, themes surrounding empowerment, disenfranchisement, and the ways in which disabled characters navigate their environments. Even Chucky occasionally uses prosthetics when engaging in his favorite activity. But before we get into all of that, there's an important question we have to ask ourselves. What exactly is disability/ableism? Okay, so for many of you, this probably seems obvious. But for those who hold this topic close to their heart, like disability activists, there's a multitude of perspectives, conceptualizations, and definitions. It's basically the dress. Depending on where you're standing, it can look vastly different from one person to another. Boorse, a professor of philosophy from the University of Delaware, really lays out the different ways folks might view concepts like disability, accessibility, and even what a barrier is. According to Boorse, when we say that someone is disabled, what we're really saying is that a person has impairment X, which significantly limits a person in activities of type A in environments of type B, and that this person deserves consequences C. Those consequences meaning how we react and attempt to accommodate those limitations. Pretty much every single one of those variables can be approached differently by a range of perspectives, which is where models of disability, or technically frameworks of analysis, come into play. I know, you're probably here because you want to hear me critique the inarguably best horror franchise some more, but surprise, I have tricked you. You're now attending a seminar on disability studies, and these credits don't count towards your degree. Kidding, sort of. But if we want to talk about disability and the potential ableism in this horror franchise, we have to narrow our perspective, and to do that, we need to lay out the framework that we'll be working with. Although if you don't want some random YouTuber lecturing you about disability studies or knowledge that you might already have, I've added chapters so you can jump ahead if you'd like. There are dozens of frameworks which exist that folks use to guide their perceptions of disability and related issues. I'm not going to go into each and every one of them. Instead, I'll talk a bit about the one that we'll be using here, the social model of disability. In short, it focuses on disability not as an inherent issue in its own right that needs to be rectified or fixed, but instead as a socially created problem with our shared environments and structures. Our bodies may function differently, our abilities like hearing, mobility, and speech may vary from person to person, but we're only worse off compared to others when we're put into a space that doesn't account for these differences. Design, whether urban, social, or media related, among others, needs to be planned with equitability in mind. It's about creating a space which accounts for the different needs that folks have. Whereas other frameworks like the medical and tragedy models victimize and remove agency from disabled persons, effectively infantilizing them, the social model positions disabled people as holistic participants who are limited not by any impairment, but by the restrictive and narrowly constructed world around them. Think of sidewalks. If you live in the global north, chances are you take curb cuts, the area at the end of sidewalks where it ramps off, for granted. Or maybe they're completely invisible in your day-to-day life. But curb cuts are an invaluable aspect of urban planning, which allows wheelchair users, folks with low mobility, and even folks pushing baby strollers/hand trucks to navigate urban spaces without outside assistance. And while it may seem like they've existed as long as sidewalks have, they're a relatively contemporary concept. Sure, a couple cities and towns started to install them in the second half of the 20th century to accommodate disabled vets coming back from World War II. But they didn't rise to prominence until the efforts of disability activists. For example, the rolling quads, based out of Berkeley University, pushed and pushed until their city council adopted and installed them across a core area of their city. 60 years later, and curb cuts have proliferated, thanks in part to legislation like the Americans with Disabilities Act, also due to the efforts of disability activists. Through the social model of disability, a person's impairment is only disabling when it's incompatible with one's environment, and the universalization of curb cuts is one of the ways that we've applied the social model of disability to our collective living standards. Without environmental barriers, there are no disabilities. And so it's with this definition that we'll craft a lens, one that we'll be looking through when discussing Chucky, Child's Play, and every element of these films. Before we continue, dear listener, I want to clarify one thing. I love Chucky. Heck, I'd even go as far as to say that it's one of my most treasured horror franchises. I wouldn't write and edit 3 nearly hour-long video essays tearing it to discursive and thematic shreds and sinew if I didn't. And that's why I think it's all the more important to point these issues out, to be honest, not just as folks who enjoy horror, but as people who watch and love the Child's Play franchise. By highlighting these issues in the series, we make them more visible across the entire genre, and I hope that it gives you, dear listener, the tools to critique some horror films that you love. It's never about ruining them or making them unwatchable, but learning to appreciate them as fully fleshed out media with strengths, faults, warts and all. Before we jump into the thick of it, parsing out how Child's Play approaches disability, I think it's important to lay out what we're working with, and don't worry, I'm not going to go over every single film in the Child's Play series, that'd be ridiculous. I've already gone over the first 5 entries in my not-so-hidden queerness with Chucky video. If you want to know more about those before we get into it, I recommend checking it out first and coming back afterwards. And if you've never watched any Child's Play film, and you're planning on going into this video blind, well, power to you. However, what I didn't talk about in that last video were the final 2 official entries by Mancini, Curse and Cult of Chucky. They're also 2 of the franchise's most relevant films when talking about disability and potential ableism in the series, so it's a good thing I've saved them. Let's start with the first of those 2, the 5th entry in the franchise, Curse of Chucky. The film acted as a sort of soft reboot for the series. It introduced new characters, interpersonal conflicts, and a setting into which Chucky and his psychopathic tendencies were thrusted. Curse centered on the Pierce clan, Sarah and Nika Pierce, a reclusive mother and her adult daughter, a wheelchair user with a heart condition and lower body paralysis. They live alone on the outskirts of town in a foreboding Victorian pseudo-manor. One day, they receive a package from an anonymous sender. It's a good guy doll, but one without all the scarring, scorching, and fraying that we naturally associate with our favorite red-headed slasher. Unsurprisingly to the viewer, there's a murder that same night. Sarah is found bloodied at the bottom of the stairs, an apparent suicide. The next day, the rest of the Pierce clan joins Nika as they arrange their mother's funeral, and over the course of one night, every family member is hunted, stalked, and murdered by the 3-foot-tall doll.
Sorry, Jack. Chucky's back.
By the end, Nika, partially through her disability, overcomes Chucky and survives. However, she's falsely found guilty of the murders and is committed to an asylum for the criminally insane. In the meantime, Chucky's free to rain havoc. Just like Karen Berkeley, no one believes Nika's screams of killer dolls. Okay, so I'll admit it, and I wouldn't be the first, but Nika Pierce isn't the worst portrayal of a disabled character out there. And even outside of horror, her character and the agency that she embodies falls into the minority of potentially positive portrayals of disabled characters. She's self-empowered. It's pretty prominent at several points in the film. She places an emphasis on her ability to determine her own lifestyle and whether she wants or needs assistance. Nika moves around her home with ease and isn't shown to have anyone's help pushed onto her, whether it's going about the house or with domestic tasks. She pushes back against her sister's attempts to place her in an assisted living facility, stating that she's perfectly able to take care of herself.
I'm disabled, Barb. I am not a child, and I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself.
And as we find out in her final showdown with everyone's favorite possessed doll, she can. Her portrayal as a disabled person is refreshing, not only for humanizing her character and avoiding media's over-reliance on portraying disability stereotypes of vulnerability and otherness, but because it casts Nika as a character, a female character, fully capable of agency, including romantic and sexual agency. Curse of Chucky opens with the Pierces receiving a delivery. Nika opens the door and has a little exchange with the delivery person. They laugh, smile, and give each other furtive glances. Her mother cuts the interaction short and infantilizes Nika through the suggestion that she can't get involved romantically or sexually with anyone, as she might ultimately get hurt. Not because she's worried that Nika might get her heart broken, but because she's worried that Nika will literally get her heart broken, emphasizing her cardiomyopathy, triggered by stress. Nika pushes back and asserts herself, putting her own agency and wants above her mother's fears. It's short, but it still remains an important moment for Nika. It's compounded in the next film where Nika has casual/enthusiastic sex with a new friend in a throwaway scene in the first act. This may not seem like it'd be that much of a big deal, or perhaps you might even see it as potentially denigrating. The overt sexualization of women compared to men in mainstream films isn't exactly groundbreaking news, but it's something that's incredibly rare when it comes to characters portrayed as having disabilities. For most of cinematic history, disabled characters, particularly women, have been desexualized, made into symbolic eunuchs. And when they are sexualized, it's more often than not used to demonize the character. Take 1957's Unfair to Remember. In it, the main character suffers an injury at the end of the first act, leaving her with paralysis in her lower extremities. She ends a blooming relationship with someone whom she loved, seeing herself now as a curse onto whomever would be with her. As she can no longer give birth, she no longer sees herself capable of becoming a wife, and by extension, being a woman. It's also a pretty sexist line of transitive properties, but hey, it's a cultural product made in a nation that hadn't criminalized marital rape until the 1970s, so what can we expect? Contemporary films featuring disabled characters have shown them more and more embracing their sexuality and bodies, but it's on this foundation that Curse/Cult of Chucky builds its own portrayal of the disabled protagonist. Nika pursues relationships, she flirts, moreover, she has unrepentant casual sex in a genre that is notorious for punishing those who step out of line and who act immoral. All of this, and she survives. Nika's a survivor, a disabled character portrayed in a way few others have been, which makes her sexual agency, as well as overall agency, all the more revolutionary. But with the good, always comes the bad. Now, broadly speaking, disabled characters can fall into one of two categories. There's films in which the character undergoes some injury or illness which causes their impairment, which tends to be the triggering event or something our protagonists need to overcome, like an Affair to Remember or your Rear Windows. And the other category encircles protagonists who are disabled from the get-go of the film. It's not a struggle or barrier that our protagonist needs to confront, but a matter-of-fact reality that causes little to no strife. It's a little reductive, but it's arguable that all disabled characters in film fall into one of these two categories, and they're both relevant when we're talking about disability in horror, and more specifically how Nika's disabilities are positioned in these films. While we are talking about the Child's Play series, this sort of discursive progress exists throughout the horror genre. Whereas we've seen an increase in the latter category, where an impairment is wholly part of our characters instead of something thrusted upon them. In the last 20 years, horror films tend to use this portrayal of disabled peoples more than other genres. By having disabled persons weaved into the narrative as fully formed characters, horror has avoided some of the common cinematic pitfalls of their portrayal. Horror films tend to uniquely situate disability in disabled characters. They're more likely to be normalized, something that these characters live with that barely affects their day-to-day lives. There's no drama, there's no existential crisis, there's no woe is me. There's only characters who have their own version of normalcy or banality. Whether we're talking about Wait Until Dark, Hush, Run, A Quiet Place, or even Curse of Chucky, all of these films center disabled characters who have long since adapted their own personal environment to their needs. Taking one of the films I just mentioned, Hush is a great example of that. Before the film's conflict comes up, we're given a glimpse into the banality of that character's everyday life. We see exactly how they've adapted their environment to their needs, as someone with a hearing impairment. There is a moment early on when our protag, Maddie, is cooking a meal. She gets distracted by a conversation and her food burns, setting off the fire alarm. However, instead of your run-of-the-mill fire alarm, right through the bones of the house, and a bright strobe light flashes. These attributes are specific to Maddie's needs, and, to those without hearing impairment, transforms their shared environment into one that's disabling for the able-bodied, as we see in the climax of the film. While more intense than in Curse of Chucky, Nika's environment is specifically tailored to her needs. Open spaces are unobstructed with enough space between furnishings for someone using a wheelchair to navigate freely. A cage elevator in the lobby allows Nika to go from floor to floor without requiring outside assistance. Although there's a bit of a hitch if ever there's a power outage, as we soon learn. Like I said earlier, disabilities don't exist in a vacuum. They're only reified as disabilities when physical, emotional, or mental differences between the individual and normative society aren't accounted for in public spaces which are intended to be shared by everyone. So it's really great that these films show this particular perspective, and moreover, that they often subvert public expectations of what it means to be disabled. The horror genre goes even a step further, and not only avoids showing these disabilities as limiting to our characters, but ultimately being a strength which helps them overcome their antagonists, whether it's fleshy home invaders or a supernaturally possessed rubber doll.
Have I got a rubber?
Yeah.
Tiff,
What?
look at me. I'm all rubber.
Oh, that's right. Wait, I thought you were plastic.
We see this best in some of the interactions between Chucky and Nika throughout Curse of Chucky. Early on, while Chucky is still playing possum, a plushy wolf among sheep if you will, Nika is carrying Chucky upstairs in her home's lift. The power goes out and, in the dark of the scene, we see the glint of steel and hear the piercing of flesh. But Nika Pierce doesn't react. Moments later, the power returns and the lift makes the last leg of its trip to the second floor. Blood drips down Nika's calf, but she doesn't react, and only realizing that she was hurt when it's pointed out by someone else. And in the third act, in a particularly gory scene, Nika uses her paralysis, and by extension her imperviousness to pain, to overcome Chucky and defeat/survive her final encounter with him. Near the end of Chucky's massacre of the Pierce clan, Nika remains the only one alive. He hunts her down, and after a brief dust-up, he drives the axe he used moments ago to end someone's life deep into her shin. Were she any other character, this would have been debilitating and opened her up to a death blow by Chucky. But she's not like any other character. She doesn't flinch when the axe crashes into her leg. Instead, Chucky hesitates. Just enough for her to pull out the axe and decapitate everyone's favorite doll. He recovers, obviously, leading to the climax of the film, but because of her disability, she's able to survive an encounter which would have been a death sentence for anyone able-bodied. She takes something which is nearly always portrayed as a weakness and twists it around to her benefit, a rare trend in films, and one that's more represented in the horror genre. Where other films may have disabled characters whose narrative challenges aren't related to their disability, they often overcome these issues despite their disability. These disabilities exist as passive barriers. They might not directly impede our protagonists, but they sure as heck don't help them. Narratively, they're value neutral in the best scenarios, and in the worst ones, they make narrative obstacles more difficult to traverse than if they were able-bodied. But that's not the case in Chucky. In fact, the roles are reversed. Nika's disability allows her to survive multiple encounters with a homicidal doll, encounters that would have been deadly if she were able-bodied. In a subversion of how disability is usually shown, able-bodiedness is a weakness, one which leads to the death of all non-disabled characters who run into Chucky. Yet, not all trends are positive. This one is, inarguably, but there are others when it comes to the betrayal of the disabled that Curse of Chucky perpetuates. That perpetuates ableism. Before we get into the next chunk of Chucky discourse, I need to go over some details of the film that I skipped over earlier. Throughout the film, we're never quite sure why Chucky chose to terrorize this particular family. They're devoid of any relationship to any previous protagonist or motivation that Chucky's shown. As far as we can tell, aside from Nika's mother's apparent obsession with painting yellow daisies, the family's quite normal. But after they congregate to make funeral arrangements for their deceased matriarch, strange things start to happen, a seemingly teleporting doll from the 80s aside. They find 16mm footage of an old family picnic, and as they're watching, our eyes are drawn to the background of the shot. A greasy-haired man in an ill-fitting suit watches the family from a distance, and later, when exploring the attic, Nika's sister finds dozens upon dozens of the same yellow daisy paintings that Sarah Pierce was working on earlier. It's not quite a surprise to fans of the series who recognize Charles Lee Ray's iconic look, but Nika makes this discovery herself with the help of a little googling and makes the connection that something isn't 100% kosher with the doll that was shipped to her home the day before. And she's right, the doll and the serial killer are one and the same, but she's too late, and Chucky massacres nearly every person in the home in quick succession. And it's at that pinnacle moment when he towers over her prone body that he decides to go on his overly expository villainous monologue, as one does in that situation. We, the viewer, and Nika learn the truth. Chucky explains that in the weeks leading up to his death, he had been introduced to Sarah Pierce. He developed an obsessive interest in the very pregnant Sarah. The film jumps forward in time. Following through with his obsession, Charles Lee Ray had murdered the Pierce patriarch and kidnapped Sarah so that he can monopolize her attention and body. He keeps her tied up and hidden away, surrounded by a mountain of yellow daisies, a sign of his twisted affection. The police show up and, in a fit of rage, Charles Lee Ray blames Sarah for their appearance and plunges his knife into her abdomen and, consequently, into Nika. He escapes, and the Pierces survive. It's in this reveal that we learn the truth behind Chucky's massacre of the Pierce clan. Chucky had unfinished business, the one who got away nearly 30 years ago. But more than that, we learn that he is the cause of Nika's disability. Her disability exists as a curse, one inflicted upon her by Chucky. Get it? Curse Chucky? Pretty subtle, right? Now, while I'm sure the writers thought that this would be an interesting twist to tie the whole story together, it unfortunately fed into a very real narrative, that disabilities aren't something that you may have from birth or develop over time that changes how you navigate your environment and live your life, but more something akin to, well, a curse. Something from which you will never recover, that will torment and plague you until the day you die. Something that will shorten your life and lower its quality. Something inherently negative. And that's how Curse of Chucky frames it. Ironic, considering that prior to the reveal that Chucky was the cause of her paralysis, Nika was empowered by her disability and lived a boring life without issue. But after the events of this film, her disabilities are no longer a simple facet of her life, but instead they transform into an extension of the trauma from which she suffered and recovers from in the franchise's sequels. And this theme isn't exactly uncommon in horror. For example, Run. If you haven't seen it, dear listener, the film follows the story of a young woman with a plethora of health conditions, including lower body paralysis, and who's a wheelchair user. We learn in the second act that her overbearing mother has been intentionally poisoning her throughout her life, and was the cause of most of her health issues, including her paralysis. Before making this horrifying discovery, the protagonist of Run was a boring girl living a boring life. Her disabilities had no impact on her outlook on life nor on her quality of life. They just were. But in this narrative, the framing of disability is transmuted and twisted. It becomes something unbearable, unthinkable. Disability becomes a curse, something that causes suffering, not due to any incompatibility with one's environment, but in itself. Instead of contextualizing disability within a social model, it positions the disabled as a victim of tragedy, someone without agency whom we should pity. You might be asking yourself, why does this matter? It's a film, not a treatise on existence, but film as a medium is political, no matter the intent of those behind it, and carries within it messages that we, the viewer, internalize, pass on, and reify. Round and round it goes. Where the intergenerational systems of prejudices will stop, nobody knows. And I guess why this actually matters is because the majority of people with disabilities aren't just born with disabilities, but rather develop them over their lifetime. According to the 2017 Canadian census, 1 in every 5 Canadians lives with a disability, and as we age, nearly half of all Canadians will have 1 or more disabilities by the time that they're over 75. Which is why these messages that films convey are important. They establish canvases that viewers can project themselves onto, a place to see themselves represented as they are, with full agency. And for those who may not have a disability yet, it sends the message to able-bodied people that it isn't something that should be feared or be the source of anxiety, but instead shows that no matter what happens, you'll still be as god-awfully boring as you are now. Yes, I'm talking specifically about you, Alex. You're a little too much into microbrews, and no one wants to hear you infodump about Warhammer. This is your wake-up call, Alex. Disabilities are not inherently curses, but these films can make it seem like they are for the viewer. Which is why the message they give, the message we see, the message we internalize is important. Cult of Chucky picks up after the events of Curse of Chucky. In it, everyone's favorite, or second favorite for you Alex Vincent stands, survivor of Chucky returns to the screen. In the concluding scene of Curse of Chucky, Nika, falsely accused and convicted for the crimes committed by Chucky, is sent to a maximum security psychiatric hospital. After months of treatment, she's transferred to a medium security institution, which is where the events of this film take place. Nika cautiously befriends a nurse attendant and several other patients, including her one-time lover who I mentioned earlier. They engage in group therapy and, surprise surprise, a good guy doll makes an appearance. Turns out that Dr. Foley, the psychiatrist assigned to the case of everyone shown on screen, decided to bring out this doll as a therapeutic tool. Nika doesn't react too well. As an aside, I'm not sure what Dr. Foley expected, but he is definitely not a good doctor. And while Nika's instincts are right, turns out that the doll is alive and once again starts a murdering. But this time with a twist. Turns out Chucky learned to split his soul and is now able to possess multiple vessels. After 7 films, you sorta need to give a spin on the old dusty formula. Like when you bust out your California raisin fursuit a decade into your loveless marriage. And a gaggle of good guy doll murders now plague the hospital. And that's when things get interesting because... Hello? Out there? If you're listening, that thing isn't me. I don't know how much longer I can cut into its broadcast, but please, I beg you, don't subscribe. Don't like its videos. I don't know how, but it's feeding off of it somehow. And with each subscription, it's getting stronger. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up, but... And so, Nika, once again our final girl, is confronted by Chucky's. But instead of defeating our villain, Charles Lee Ray transfers his soul into Nika and takes over her body. He, in Nika's body, reunites with Tiff and they share a passionate kiss. Happy ending for queer viewers, less so for Nika. I'll be honest, this wasn't my favorite release. Sure, it was well received by critics and fans alike, but it felt a little flat to me. Which isn't to say it wasn't enjoyable. Fiona Dourif continued to flex her acting chops, and Brad Dourif's nails on a chalkboard voice is a continuous pleasure to hear. Alex Vincent even made a comeback as Andy for the first time in 4 films. Okay, so he was in a post-credits scene in Curse of Chucky, but let's not be too pedantic. But I had a couple issues with how this film approached disability and the institutions which serve the needs of this particular community that I'd like to share with you. Okay, so first, let's talk about the good. because there absolutely is some in how the film approaches disability. And I've been bullying the series and its writing for nearly half an hour now, so why not lay off it for a minute? Films have more than a tendency of taking the otherness of the mentally ill to the extreme, especially those that may focus on security psychiatric hospitals. Mental illness is viewed as erratic, as violent, as animalistic. Take 2018's Halloween, for example. In our first introduction to Michael Myers, we see him and other patients chained to the floor of the courtyard in what is supposed to be considered their leisure time. Now, call me a degenerate modernist, but I don't believe people should be treated like animals chained to the floor for any reason. Hey, unless that's your thing. The witching hour doesn't kink shame. Cult of Chucky subverts this portrayal by humanistically approaching characters with mental illness. It's a fairly minimalistic cast, but none of the characters that we see are violent. Sure, they've all been committed to this hospital, and as we learn, they've all been sentenced for violent crimes, but it doesn't define their personalities. They're not erratic, we don't expect them to fly off the handle at a moment's notice based on how they're portrayed. Instead, they're flawed, trying their best to manage past traumas and come to terms with their actions. They form friendships, support one another, and exist on a spectrum of personalities. Although their personalities do come off flatter than Manitoba, but that's more of a critique of the writing more than anything else. They're victims, not just of Chucky, but of a society that's failed them. There's still some issues in the portrayal, not of disability, but in the institution that serves as the setting of this film, the asylum, or more accurately, the security psychiatric hospital. Cult of Chucky uses a heavy white and blue color correction palette in its filming. Its sets are wide and empty, sometimes only a handful of characters milling around in a large and empty rec room. Both of these, I assume, are used to convey a sense of sanitization, of alienation, but it cloaks the truth of these sorts of institutions. While the asylum had a slew of systemic issues in how it treated the patient from its popularization in the 19th century in the United States, these problems were only exacerbated through the second half of the 20th century. States cut funding to these institutions time and time again, and the dismantling of community support networks led to overpopulation as the subaltern. Anyone and everyone who was othered without a voice was involuntarily placed in these institutions. Many contemporary psychiatric hospitals are overcrowded, more people that need services than there are services to provide. The image of half a dozen or so patients being served by 2 full-time nurses and a psychiatrist who gives both individual and group therapy is a bit ridiculous in this context. Now, realistically, there probably wasn't enough budget to fill scenes with extras, and it would require more than a little suspension of disbelief for Chucky to be sneaking around, murdering, if folks are bunking 2 to a room, but work with me here. I'm trying to be overly critical of a cheesy 80s horror franchise. There's one more issue that I haven't talked about yet, but it applies to several of the films in the franchise and the television show. It's a bit of a big one. Fiona Dourif, Nika's actor, plays a disabled character, but is not herself disabled. At least not in any way comparable to the character she plays. Able-bodied actors playing disabled characters ain't nothing new. Daniel Day-Lewis won the Academy Award for his performance as Christy Brown in My Left Foot, and the previously mentioned character Terry from An Affair to Remember was portrayed by Deborah Kerr, both of whom are able-bodied. In fact, the vast majority of actors filling the roles of disabled characters don't share their disabilities. In horror, the only disabled actors that really come to mind are Kiera Allen in Run and Millicent Simmons in A Quiet Place. Although if you know of any other particular performances, feel free to let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear them. There's a bunch of issues when it comes to this topic. The first and most obvious is that it takes away jobs from actors who really do have those impairments. Folks might assume that people with disabilities just don't work in the entertainment industry. But the reality is that there are thousands of talented actors who are being passed over time and time again, with studios choosing to fill the role of disabled characters with able-bodied actors. And that's sort of the issue with Curse and Cult of Chucky. There's no reason why they couldn't have simply cast an actor who already uses a wheelchair, and I looked around. In commentaries and interviews, the creators never really addressed this issue. I've seen speculation that the reason why they cast Fiona Dourif, Brad Dourif's daughter, in the role is because they wanted an actor who resembled Brad Dourif's physique from the first film.
When I was thinking about who would be the perfect person to play young Charles Lee Ray, the answer was, right in front of my face. She already looks so much like her father, especially from here up.
Whether you accept that explanation or assume that legacy nepotism may have played a part, the reality is that so far, there hasn't been a need for Nika's actor to look that much like Brad Dourif. I mean, in the new television series, there's a series of flashbacks where they adorn Nika in a wig, makeup, and prosthetics to become the spitting image of Brad Dourif from earlier films, and also eerily like a younger Alice Cooper. But they could have done the same with any actor. I mean, they had to use wigs, makeup, and prosthetics after all. They might argue that they need an able-bodied actor in case of scenes which might require more mobility than a disabled actor is capable of. Whether those are scenes that take place prior to the character's disability, or dream sequences, or possession by the spirit of a serial killer from the 1980s, creators might bring these up as explanations of their biases. But that's the thing, these are biases. These scenes are entirely doable, whether it's with wires, CGI, or body doubles. They can do the same shots with disabled actors. Heck, it's not like they cloned an actual dinosaur for Jurassic Park, nor was Carrie Fisher resurrected on the third day by God to appear in episode 9. Both were brought to the silver screen by VFX, and it's more than possible for them to do the same for disabled actors/characters. So why don't they? Not to be that person blaming everything on capitalism, but it's sort of maybe definitely because of capitalism. VFX would cost more than using able-bodied actors. Same for using cinematography to work around the disabled actor. I'm sure if given the opportunity, studios would have probably used an actual T-Rex.
Bingo. Dino DNA.
If it were cheaper rather than use animatronics, even if it would be slightly less difficult to work with than Chevy Chase.
Very funny, punk.
I think it's important to point out that, realistically, it wouldn't add that much to the budget. It'd be minuscule, non-existent really, compared to the amount of funds that studios dedicate towards the marketing of projects. Unless you're releasing a guerrilla film, marketing can come up to 50% of all prior film costs. So why not divest some funding? If I'm being honest, I think the issue is probably that a lot of creators just haven't wrapped their minds around the concept of accommodating disabled actors. Or, more accurately, making their productions accessible to all of their workers. Maybe they're not aware that they can make these changes, or maybe they don't have a say in who's cast, their production operating under a strict decision-making hierarchy. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic and giving filmmakers the benefit of the doubt. They're still perpetuating harm and continuing ableist practices in film, but at least there's no nefarious intentionality behind it, right? Before I end this broadcast, dear listener, I'd like to touch on one more important instance of ableism that can not only be found in these two films, but has been pervasive since the conceptualization of the first Child's Play film. It's something that's been bubbling under the surface for decades, unbeknownst to the millions who have consumed these films, and unfortunately whose change is unlikely, and if it were to happen, would entail undermining disability representation under a whole new light. And it all comes back to Chucky. Not the character I mean, but his actor. When we think of Chucky, our minds inevitably wander to the Joycey smooth dulcets of Brad Dourif. He's as inseparable from the character as Chucky is to him. But what most folks may not realize, or perhaps they do but they just don't care enough to give it much thought, is that there's always been a physical actor behind the character of Chucky, and if not for him or her, Child's Play would have fallen apart mid-production, and we wouldn't have gotten the beloved film franchise we have today. When Child's Play first went into development, its director and FX supervisor Tom Holland and Howard Berger were confronted with a glaring issue. The puppet, which they used for Chucky, was difficult to maneuver. In the words of Kirshner, if you've got someone controlling the eyes, someone else the mouth, and someone else the hands, something will go wrong. It's gonna take a very long time. They went ahead with the puppet regardless. At the time, animatronics weren't popular, so the tech was pretty rudimentary. The doll couldn't quite walk naturally. The dolly they used was closer to dragging across the floor than it was to any sort of natural movement. And when Chucky attacked Karen Berkeley, they just stuck the doll onto a power drill and turned it on. And it wasn't the most sturdy. It was quick to degrade. Its skeletal structure would poke through the rubber exterior after being used for a few shoots, which complicated things. In a single day, they'd go through 3 pairs of hands. Berger laughed that he'd walk around the set with a stack of replacement Chucky hands tied to his belt. Which is why they brought on Ed Gale. Fresh from Howard the Duck and Phantasm 2, Gale was an up-and-coming little actor who was brought onto the project by Berger. While they needed to build special sets a third larger than reality to accommodate Gale's size and to make it proportionate to Chucky's, it made filming all the more easier. Chucky became a lively character, one whose movements were closer to natural than the previously used animatronics. And all that was due to Gale's work in the role. He was humble, referring to Child's Play. He said that, "I don't take credit for being Chucky. It's Brad Dourif, the puppeteers, and me." Which, fair. But if that's the case, why is he and subsequent little actors who have filled the role of Chucky left forgotten by fans and production in the annals of Child's Play history? And Brad Dourif elevated as the quintessential representation of Chucky. First off, I don't think the lack of legacy for little actors in Child's Play or their impact on the series was directly due to anyone involved in the film's production. There wasn't any conscientious maliciousness on the part of production towards these actors. Okay, and maybe I'm being a little charitable here. What happened in 1988's Child's Play is something that continues to happen to this day, and that receives very little coverage compared to the general exploitative nature of the film industry. What I'm hinting towards is the undervaluing and exploitation of little people as entertainers. Before I get into it, I do want to state that the inclusion of little people, also known as LPs, in this video's topic might be a contentious one in the community. Many dwarves don't consider themselves disabled, instead viewing themselves as able-bodied, but many do align themselves with disability activism in their pursuit of equal treatment and tackling societal prejudices towards LPs. The LPA and LPC, which stands for the Little People of America and Little People of Canada, are nonprofits which advocate for the rights of folks with dwarfism and are similarly divided. Ultimately, they aim to make public life more accessible to little people, like ATMs being available to anyone of any height, which does align with the social model of disability that we've been using throughout this video. But ultimately, the treatment of Ed Gale and other little actors within the production of the Child's Play franchise is why I believe it's important to cover this topic, so let's return to the video. Since the 19th century, LPs have been a part of the entertainment industry, although often derided and the target of ridicule. With the advent of film, little people were more and more sought after by producers to fill certain roles. Take, for example, The Wizard of Oz. Yet their involvement was nearly always exploitative. 225 little people were involved in the production of Oz, playing the roles of munchkins. Yet their conditions were poor and they were undervalued. Each actor received a pittance of $50 weekly for their work. The dog that played Toto was paid $125. And this sort of treatment continued for decades. Whether it's Star Wars or Charlie's Chocolate Factory, little actors are continuously exploited. And for the longest time, many felt they couldn't complain, that any pushback would lead to their termination and replacement. There's always more where you came from, as they say. And to some degree, that's true. Dwarves have the highest rate of entertainment as a profession than any other group, and there's consistently more actors than there are roles, which ultimately leads to little actors accepting harmful and exploitative conditions. This might describe the situation that Ed Gale was placed in. For the character of Chucky, he not only filled the role when it came to the latter's movements, but he also performed all of his stunts, something little actors have little agency towards. The signature scene in Child's Play's third act, where Chucky is burnt alive and runs towards Andy whilst on fire, was performed by Gale, and he didn't get out of the scene unscathed. He had minor burns and was accidentally dropped from a dangerous height, which put him out of commission with a concussion for a few days. But he endured, because he had to. Ed Gale would return to the role of Chucky in Child's Play 2, skipping the third and coming back for Bride of Chucky, and not participating in any other Child's Play production, his experience with the series darkening over time. In a post-production interview with Fangoria, John Lafia, when asked about the degree of involvement of Ed Gale in the production of Child's Play, said, "No, I hired him but never used it." Imagine being referred to with a slur, not even to your face, but in a popular, nationally circulated magazine, that the people who watch your film will read. You're no longer an essential part of the film, you're a tool, a nit. After that, Gale left Child's Play, only returning for Bride of Chucky when asked repeatedly. Unfortunately, after seeing the script for Seed of Chucky and John Waters' line about
I'm masturbating.
he refused to be a part of Seed. I don't blame him. Like most folks who watched this film for the first time, I didn't think twice about the slur being used. Heck, when I was a kid, I didn't even think of it as a slur. And I think that's the worst part of its inclusion. It normalizes a prejudicial term, one that the LP community has been working on dismantling for decades. It teaches folks that it's an acceptable term, and it's not like the Child's Play production team was unaware of the potential harm that it could cause. They had already lost their Chucky actor once because of its flagrant use. It took me years after watching the film to understand the impact of this word, and I'm someone who goes out of her way to read papers on disability studies. I can only imagine that the average person might go their entire lives without coming to terms with the implicit harm that this term carries, especially as film and television continue to use it liberally. Now, I think it's important to say that Don Mancini, creator of the series and queer horror icon, addressed this a few years ago while filming Curse of Chucky. In an interview, Mancini admitted that the line, was wrong, and it's my responsibility. It's not much, but it's more than what Lafayette had confessed, and it shows a genuine understanding of the potential harm the inclusion of that line may have caused. Over the last decade or so, the Child's Play franchise has made less and less use of little people in its production. Debbie Lee Carrington starred in Curse, and Lyndon Boorse starred in Cult. And the key reason they've made less and less use of little actors is the same as to why they started using them in the first place. And heck, arguably the driving force behind most decisions in the entertainment industry: greed. The team behind Child's Play were quite honest about why they sought out to use a little person to fill the role of Chucky. As I alluded to earlier, Chucky was a difficult person to work with. Breaking down on set, giving his castmates the cold shoulder, he was the Chevy Chase of animatronic dolls. He would need constant repairs and extra puppeteers on hand to make sure his performance was done as well as possible. It was costly for sure, but doable. But like most productions, staying on budget and finding fat to cut is as important as having a finished product to those at the tippy top of film's corporate ladder. So they decided to bring on an LP to fill the role for certain scenes that had complicated movements. Sure, they had to build custom sets that were a third larger than reality, but one-Ed Gale was cheaper than the dozens of dolls and puppeteers that would have to be added to the payroll. Even then, the studio tried to save money wherever possible. According to Gale, he was officially listed as a stunt double by the production instead of an acting cast member for financial reasons. One of the reasons they credited me like that was so they could pay me fewer residuals. Residuals, the amount paid to credited cast members. I'm sure Gale would have gotten a pretty penny based solely on the number of times I watched a Child's Play rerun at 2 in the morning. And then, for the same reasons they had decided to use an LP in the Child's Play franchise, they began to use them less and less. The cost of actors increases over time, even those that are underpaid, and they still had to recreate sets that were proportionate to the size of their little actors. And, at the time, CGI animatronics and puppetry got cheaper and cheaper, and started looking better and better. It's an unfortunate reality to which Mancini talked about in an interview for Curse. One reason we used fewer little actors as the series went on is because it's expensive to build sets 30% larger. Each successive movie, we had less and less money. Both Curse and Cult had little actors filling the role of Chucky's double, but as far as I can tell, they completely stopped casting little actors and had none in the recent television series. Why pay a union's wage when you can create a person out of thin air? The ideal, as you can imagine, would be to make these positions equitable, to bring workplace security to actors in franchises like Child's Play. And for those of you who may be watching who consider yourselves chuckleheads, starting to see Ed Gale as Chucky in the same way we associate our favorite doll with Brad Dourif. Because without either of them, the franchise wouldn't be the same, if at all. And so, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into ableism and disability in the Child's Play series. There were a few points I haven't touched on, like Nika's conclusion in Season 1 of the Chucky series, but to be honest, I'd rather not put the horse before the cart. It could be another instance of disability being used as a curse, as a means to punish the able-bodied, but I want to give this storyline a chance. Maybe they'll use this opportunity to address some of the issues I've been blabbing about. Only time will tell. If you like this video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/witchinghourYT. You'll get access to extra features, early scripts and videos, and can vote on future topics that we'll cover. With that said, please like the video, subscribe, ring the bell. The Witching Hour, signing off.